And while I think it's reasonable that folks should have some flexibility in the workplace, I have sort of felt that the work from home mentality, which again only happened as a result of a global pandemic.
And the ability to recruit, retrain, and motivate great people. I think it's, I would hold up this work environment against any. And I think the answer is yeah, the companies would be just as successful.
Welcome to Candid Minds with Dr. T. I'm Dr. Tamir Aldad, addiction psychiatrist and CEO of Mindful Care, the first ever psychiatric urgent care committed to providing affordable and accessible mental health care. Hello and welcome back. I'm Dr. T, the host of Candid Minds, addiction psychiatrist and the CEO of Mindful Care. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be discussing navigating success and the startup mindset. We have two really great guests for you, and it'll be a great conversation looking at how work ethic has changed post-pandemic, particularly those that are working in remote jobs versus hybrid jobs. And as a founder, it's an issue that I am very passionate about. It's important for me to dictate culture, or at least inspire others to build a culture that promotes a healthy work environment and one where employees and staff thrive. So I think about this issue often and was excited to speak to our guests today and hear their opinions so I could better formulate mine and incorporate some of my ideas, listen to theirs, and learn from how they've been able to build successful companies with positive cultures and how they're navigating the post pandemic workplace. With us today, we have Spencer Rascoff. Spencer is the founder of Hotwire and Zillow, two successful companies. We also have Matthew Wadiak, who's the founder of Blue Apron, both strong serial entrepreneurs. And some of the things we discuss are general changes in work ethic. I think it's clear if we look at our parents, the way we're working today is very different from the way they used to work back in the day and how that's shifted over time. We talk about remote work and what that really means. All of us had to work remotely during the pandemic. Some of us are transitioning back to the office, some hybrid models, some aren't transitioning back at all. Are there consequences to those decisions? Are there not? So we navigate that and explore it a little bit. And then we talk about the mental health impact of different types of work environments. And what does that mean for productivity? Is there a change in terms of burnout? Are employees and staff members more or less likely to burn out depending on their type of work arrangement? And what's best to develop intrinsic motivation, meaning what's best to encourage employees to thrive and succeed and contribute and feel like they're a valuable member of an organization, advancing that organization's mission. Particularly in my conversation with Spencer, we talk about how to build that strong culture and how not to sacrifice productivity. And it was a great chat. So I'm glad he joined us and I look forward to sharing it with you. With Matthew Wadiak, we talked a little bit as well about that remote work and its challenges, highlighting differences in the perspectives of various work arrangements. But particularly with Matthew is he was less convinced that remote work is a viable model. And I thought that was interesting because I particularly find a hybrid work environment very conducive to success, particularly when it comes to employees developing rapport and a relationship with one another, collaborating with one another. I don't think the strength of relationships is the same when you've never met the individual. I know people tell me that that is not true, but from anecdotally, from my own experience and running a fairly large organization, I've noticed that employees that develop relationships with one another, and ultimately some develop even friendships, their commitment to each other's work and projects and eagerness to collaborate is very different than those that only see each other virtually for a few minutes or a few hours a day, several times a week. So also, really interesting talking about these issues with Matthew. And we also dive a little bit into work life balance and what's considered healthy versus what's not. So I'm glad you're joining us, and I look forward to sharing these conversations with you. All right. So we have Spencer Rascoff today joining me, a good friend, founder of Hotwire and Zillow. Spencer, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. So we've been discussing generational changes in work ethic and mental health and its impact. I'm curious, having started two very successful companies, What have you seen in terms of work ethic generationally? Of course, also pre and post COVID, and what's your perception of where that's headed?
So I think social media, like it highlights extremes. So obviously the theme of quiet quitting or other forms of kind of chillaxing tend to go viral. But in my experience, there have always been people in every generation with a variety of work ethics. Um, and I'm not sure that it's changed all that much nowadays than in the past. Clearly, it's more visible. We see examples on social media of people, and older generations always like to say younger generations are slackers, but I think it's always been that way. So I don't know. I feel that I encounter people in their teens and 20s all the time who are working incredibly hard, extremely motivated, want to achieve success, and they probably do have a little bit more balance in their lives than maybe my generation did. But that doesn't mean that they're not ambitious and hardworking. It just means that they're more attuned to the importance of mental health, and that's a good thing. And it means that they are, hardworking, but maybe they work a little bit smarter than past generations. There's less need for FaceTime than there once was.
The smart working is interesting because something we talked about a little earlier on the episode was burnout.
Mhm.
Do you feel this generation is better prepared to prevent burnout compared to our generation? And what have you seen in terms of companies and organizations really preparing their employees for success to prevent employee burnout?
When I was my first job out of college was at Goldman Sachs in the late '90s as an investment banker, and we pulled all nighters 3 or 4 nights a week. And I remember I used to leave my sport jacket. Everyone used to leave their sport jacket on their chair, so that
Sure.
when you eventually went home at night at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, whenever, if somebody walked by your desk, they would assume that you were still there, and
Yep.
people would they would never take the elevator on their floor. Instead, they would walk down a couple floors and then take the elevator home at night from a different floor,
So
lest
I
you
would do the same thing with my lab coat in medicine. I would leave it around so people think I didn't leave
right.
the hospital.
So I think that that's not a great way to live, and I think that that behavior is not nearly as prevalent in today as it was when I was coming up, and that's a good thing. So that need to have FaceTime and look like you're constantly working, that's just not necessary anymore. The fact is that with technology as it is today, everybody is always working and is much more connected than they ever used to be. When I would eventually go home at 2 in the morning, I could at least sleep on the subway on my way back home. Nowadays, you'd be staring at your phone and still working. And as soon as you wake up, you immediately start working. So I think technology, it's a blessing and a curse. It's allowed us to have a harder time separating work from personal, but it also allows us to work a little smarter uh, and get away from the office, which is really important for mental health as well. So on balance, I think this is a better work environment where people can still achieve, still be ambitious, still aim for success, but they don't have to be. It's no longer cool to pull an all-nighter. And it used to
Sure.
be cool and a requirement. And I think that's a good thing that society has changed in that way.
So how does one, if you have access to like Microsoft Teams or Slack or whatever you're using, how do you make sure that your work life balance is really balanced? And I think there is a concern that it could be perceived as someone who isn't committed or dedicated.
Yeah.
If at 9 p.m. your director or your VP is messaging you and you decide to really set boundaries, what do you do to not be misperceived as somebody who isn't passionate about the mission or the cause and have that be held against you?
Well, so that work culture comes from the top. For example, if I'm on Slack at 10 or 11 at night or something, I'll schedule my Slacks to come in the morning, to go out in the morning. So they're not going at night because I'm trying to set a good example for my teams that that I'm not working all night long. And certainly my bosses, when I was 20 years ago, nobody would have been that kind or thoughtful to me. But that's how I tend to manage and lead. And then that creates a culture at the companies that I'm involved in, which whereby people understand that it's important to work hard, but also to work smart and not burn out, and that it's a marathon, not a sprint, and it's okay for people to take time off. So you lead by example in your exec team meetings. You share what you did over the weekend. It's okay to say that you're a little bit tired today and you're going to be dragging. It's okay to say that you're going to be offline from 12 to 3 because you got to get to the
Mhm.
doctor. Like, that's all okay, and that tone gets set from the top. There are some companies that are not like that, and I think people self-select out of those companies for ones that are a little bit more balanced. That having been said, all the companies I'm involved in are startups, and startups are a grind. People need to work harder and work smarter because they're constantly at risk of running out of money and going bankrupt.
Right.
And so people do need to understand that that's going to be a certain type of intensity, but it doesn't have to be at a level 10 all the time of intensity. Like, people need to back down to a 6 or 7 for periods of time. And I think it's important that from the top you set that expectation and that culture.
And do you think, I mean, talking about that work life balance, and if you have to go to the doctor, you can. Do you think the success of the organization or the startup, you could be tipping the scales in the other direction, meaning you're very sensitive to someone's mental health, which is great. And I know a lot of our listeners will appreciate hearing that. But where are we drawing the line that it's at the expense of the success of the organization? Meaning,
Yeah.
how are we, if it is coming from the top and we are making the focus, the success of the employee, which I obviously fully support, and that's something we do in our organization as well, there is also a responsibility and a fiduciary duty too, that you're not overcorrecting. And how do you make sure that there aren't that employees don't take that too far?
Yeah.
Where are you drawing
It's
that
it's
line?
it's really hard, especially hard in a remote environment, because it's difficult to get visibility into how much everyone is contributing, and are they at a, are they between an 8 and a 10, which is kind of where I'd want people to be, or are they
Mhm.
between a 4 and a 6, on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of
Right.
intensity. Um, the you look at output, you look at results, and that's what this remote work revolution has demonstrated and has allowed for, whereby the way I do it is I set deadlines and hold people accountable to output, not hours. So,
Mhm.
when can we ship that product? Okay, can we ship it in 2 weeks? Okay, when can I see the designs for that new feature? Can I see it tomorrow? When will that press release be written? Can I see it a day and a half from now? And then, like, I don't care if you're at the doctor or at the beach or picking
Right.
your kid up from school or whatever. Um, you get your work done, and again, this is a very different culture than 5, 10 years ago, and not all companies work like this. My first startup, Hotwire, was not like this at all. It was very much
Sure.
a work from 10 a.m. to 8 or 9 p.m., then go to dinner nearby in downtown San Francisco, like, with your teams, go back to the
And then
office and
come
stay there
back to
till 1 in the
dinner.
morning. Yeah, that
Yeah,
was
for
like the way
sure.
it was in the late 90s, early 2000s, and
Mhm.
and in my early 20s. And there are probably some companies that are still like that, and that's fine. That's not for me, and that's not for most of the people that work in my companies. Um, but I think if you manage people to results rather than time spent, I think that's the right balance.
Absolutely. I mean, if you have those metrics in place, those KPIs in place, and people are metric driven, and there's full transparency as to what those metrics are, they can hold themselves accountable. So I think that's huge. I wonder, looking at the success of Hotwire and Zillow, and some of the companies that you've started, do you feel they would be just as successful with today's work ethic and today's
Mm,
um, perspective on time management, or a hybrid model, or a
yeah,
fully remote model, if you were
it's a great question. I
to
think the
relaunch
answer,
them?
yeah, I think the answer is, they would be just as successful, maybe even more successful, but it's a little bit less. They'd be a little bit less fun, and there is something about the pulling of an all-nighter, the team building of being in the office, the high-fiving when you ship a product, and you're there in person, the signing a term sheet for a funding round and everybody's
Mm.
there and clinking champagne, warm champagne in solo cups, like that you just can't replicate in a remote
Yeah.
environment or in a, let's call whatever we're calling this other, whether it's remote or in office, kind of this, operate at an 8, not operate at a 10 environment. Um, so the highs are not as high, the lows are not as low, but in terms of the actual business results and the ability to recruit, retain, and motivate great people, I think it's, I would hold up this work environment against any. And I think the answer is yeah, the companies would be just as successful, if not a little less
That's
fun.
real. That's really interesting because the commiserating builds incredible camaraderie,
Yeah.
right? It's comparable to like pledging a fraternity or sorority, right? There's bonds that are built there, just going through the gauntlet together.
Yeah.
The highs together also builds a lot of camaraderie. And I agree with you. You might not. You're missing out on that, and you might be just as successful. But I wonder if that's very nearsighted, meaning short term you could be equally as effective being remote or hybrid. Um, but do you think that that leads to a long term almost lack of loyalty to an organization where you're not as connected to that company because you haven't come to HQ, you've never met anyone face to
Yeah.
face? It's almost easier to quit in that
It
sense
is.
where
Yeah.
you're
It's a
not
risk.
as
It's yeah.
yes, there's a risk there in that you're not as emotionally invested
Yep.
because have you ever seen the CEO? Have you ever hands with anyone? And if the answer is no, I wonder if your attachment is comparable to sitting next to someone every day, having lunch with someone every day, um, and that risk is real. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so that is a definite risk, and but it can be mitigated. There's no question that some employees think to themselves, "Oh, hold on, I can just click on a different Zoom link, and I'm now at a different company. And if that
Right.
company's going to pay me 10% more, who cares? I'm just in some other
Yeah.
virtual Zoom room." But I would argue that that's a failure of that first company that lost the employee. That's not. It doesn't have to be that way. So Picasso,
Interesting.
for example, which I'm co-founder and chair of, we have a couple hundred employees. It's entirely remote. It always has been. We started pre-COVID remote, and we have a very strong workplace culture. We have excellent employee retention. We have employees that feel connected to the mission. We do in-person events. We just had our all company annual meeting in Arizona for a week, and everyone bonded, and then different teams get together in person, and the exec team gets together in person. So we're doing in-person events every couple weeks or couple months.
Mhm.
But we also work really hard to build company culture internally through video conferencing and through Slack, and it works. And so I haven't looked at the data, but I bet the employee retention among Picasso in its first 3 years of entirely remote is as good or better as the employee retention of Zillow in its first 3 years of in office. And the type of people that we can attract at Picasso, because we're remote and because it doesn't require everyone to live in a single city and pull all nighters and work 24/7, are much more experienced and more mature. I mean,
Mm.
we're able to attract parents that live in, whatever, rural Idaho, instead of people in their 20s that live in San Francisco or Seattle. And it allows for a better, more diverse workforce, and I think creates better products. So on balance, I think it's a better situation, but it's not always that way. There are plenty of companies that don't invest in people and culture and do suffer from retention issues because it is harder to build culture remotely.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, it does require extra energy to have that level of EQ and sensitivity to mitigate that risk, but it's obviously paying dividends. So I certainly salute you for making that a priority, and clearly it's worthwhile. To wrap up, I'd be curious, knowing what you know about where we are now in terms of work ethic. and startup culture. What advice would you give your old self a couple of years ago,
Well,
seeing
yeah.
where we are today?
So I even though I'm espousing the benefits of a remote environment, the truth is that if I were early career, like when my
Hmm.
kids come out of college, I'll encourage them to join an in-office company. I think
Mm.
early career, it's really helpful to get the mentorship and personal connection, and that's very difficult to build remotely. So that's one piece of advice I would give, which would be find an in-office company and culture. The other advice I give to early career people is to solve problems for your managers. Don't just do the job that you've been tasked. Actually think, what is my manager's biggest challenge and how can I help them solve it? And if you do that, if you solve problems for the people around you, in addition to doing your job well, you'll get ahead, and that will advance your career.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice, especially early on. A skill that I noticed individuals that even we have here that have never worked in an office, their ability to read a room, their ability to pick up social cues seem to be not very polished. And it makes the conversation very challenging because there are nuances in a conversation beyond just what you say that help propel the conversation forward. And if you're
Right.
unable to pick up on that because you've never interacted with anyone outside of your bedroom, it slows down your success and your trajectory. So I think that's excellent advice, especially for those starting early on. Well, I think that's really been interesting, Spencer. I appreciate you taking the time to join us and coming on today. Would love to welcome you back to the show anytime. Appreciate your ongoing support and enjoyed the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. You too. I'd like to welcome Matthew Wadiak to show. He's the founder of Blue Apron and a serial entrepreneur with a lot of experience on the topics that we're discussing, primarily with changes in generational work ethic, having seen a lot of changes in the workforce. Matthew, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So we've been discussing particularly quiet quitting versus what traditionally was hustle culture. And I'd be curious to hear your opinion regarding quiet quitting. Is this really something that as organizations we need to focus on and culture needs to really shift to support individuals navigating the changes in the work environment? What have you seen and what is your opinion?
I think, during the pandemic, we certainly saw more people who were resigned to having the opportunity to work from home and work remotely. And while that was going on, the juxtaposition was that startups and e-commerce and, better part of new economy type businesses were hustling and moving from an operational standpoint. So the folks who have the opportunity to work from home, I think became a little bit disconnected with what would normally take place in a business interaction, which would be direct relationship with um, operations teams and teams that work together in person and build. And I think a lot of businesses paid the price of that, and we saw that. And while I think it's reasonable that folks should have some flexibility in the workplace, I have sort of felt that the work from home mentality, which again only happened as a result of a global pandemic, is not something that's really long term sustainable. Now, will people work maybe a Friday from home and be in the office more days a week? Yeah, I think that's okay. I think that's reasonable, and people should be able to adjust their schedules as long as they're getting their stuff done. But at the end of the day, a company needs to run off of a financial and an operational dashboard. And
Hmm.
a board of directors will create a set of goals for a business, and individuals need to hit those goals. If you can do that from home, great, but it's very hard to create the necessary interactions that are important for a business operation to take place strictly remotely in any kind of business that has physical ops. That might be different story for businesses that I'm less experienced with that are strictly, spreadsheet management. But my perspective is that it's important to
Yeah.
have people together.
No, absolutely. And what's interesting there is who's supposed to carry the burden there, right? The delta that's created by people maybe being less productive working from home Is it on the organization to be more supportive, which I think is what where we're feeling the pressure? And as someone who runs a large psychiatric urgent care, I feel that too. Or are we telling individuals that are working from home, you need to overcompensate for the fact that you have the luxury to work from home? Where do you think the correction has to be for especially hybrid models to be successful?
In every organization, there's going to be some component of people who have to be in an office, right? And I think that there's an unfair burden of folks who have to go in if they're not getting the support they need, if part of their job is suffering due to lack of interaction. So I again, like I can't stress this enough. The norm for last 100 plus years was to go into work, and only because we had this unique sort of snippet in time did we have an instance where we didn't have to do that for a period of time. Now you see Jamie Dimon and like all these different business leaders around the world who are saying, hey, like even in the financial sector, in the operations sector, in the business sector, manufacturing, we have to get back into work as office employees. There's a reason why I think CEOs are asking for that. And I think the whole work from home post pandemic was an overcorrection. Early on, there was reporting about how it was healthy and good to work from home. And then, not 6 months later, all the articles started coming out about productivity and slipping numbers and efficacy in the workplace. And I think the jury's out now that efficacy in the workplace has suffered from sole remote work. Maybe there's some hybridization that could work in the future, but everybody's also different. For me personally, and I can only speak for
Mhm.
myself, if I don't get out of my house and go somewhere to work, then I know that I'm not as productive.
Absolutely. And I could tell you from a mental health perspective, interacting with people or what we call behavioral activation, which means even if you're having mental health symptoms, fighting against them and putting things on your schedule and going out and doing things, those are all actually therapeutic. So staying at home and essentially avoiding dealing with the outside world could actually be very taxing for an individual. What do you think organizations need to do to really promote this correction back to what we knew was an effective work environment? And perhaps at Blue Apron, you did things that were effective, but how do you think we can promote it in a way where it is supportive, it is encouraging, taking the approach that we have a board and we have P&Ls that we have to answer to? I don't think that, a lot of people that would kind of resonate with a lot of people, but
Yeah.
what do you think or what have you done that fosters a more successful transition back?
I'm really an operator by course, so there's stuff to do, right? And I think, making a transition back is fairly easy when you have things that physically have to happen and
Mm.
places you have to go to, like a site that you have to go to. I've always been very interactive in the workplace, and I think creating interactivity, having working groups that meet in person, having consultants come on that can lead ambassadorship and uh, you know brand conversations that you can't do remotely. Is a very big difference between interacting and problem solving with a person that's in the same room as you at the other side of the table versus trying to do that on a Zoom, and you can't really totally read them and feel um, you know their gestures and their movements and
Oh
how
yeah,
they,
reading the room is a big problem that we have. It's almost like people's EQ drops when you're doing these Zoom calls, and then you put them in a meeting, and there's a lot of subtext that they pick up on and nuances in the conversation that make them so much more effective at communicating. Whereas a message could fall super flat on Zoom because you couldn't read body language, you barely saw facial expressions, you missed some sort of eye roll that would have cued you that you're not going in the right direction with the feedback you're giving. So it's almost a handicap in a way where if you're trying to be a good leader, your those social cues are taken away from you when you don't have that face-to-face interaction.
I think that's totally right. So I think, to answer your question fully, to foster that going back into the workplace, I think that that happens with some amount of organic transition just by good leaders incubating the idea and cultivating the idea of working together through working groups and through facilitators who can bring people back and help. And that's always good stuff anyway, right? Anytime you bring an advisor in to help interplay with a group, you'll generally get some kind of outcome.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good idea, and I think even listeners that would benefit from something like that can bring that to their managers and their supervisor and encourage uh, that type of culture. So I think that's an excellent suggestion. One thing we talked about before you joined us was burnout, and it happens across the organization. Someone who's founded a successful startup, but it also happens to everyone from the team lead to the supervisor to the manager to the director and the VPs. What have you done that has been successful for you to stay focused, not lose momentum, and continue being productive and effective?
Well, everybody's different, right? So people get burned out from different things, and people have different home stresses that can contribute to that, right? So somebody who's
Hmm.
at home with young kids might have different, lifestyle and burnout threshold for too much travel, right? Whereas somebody who is easily bored with doing the same thing every day might get burned out from sitting in at a desk. And for me personally, I found that creating the right balance of stimulation between offsite travel, working with maybe an ops team one day, a finance team one day, having a little bit of diversity in my
Hmm.
diet of work, um, allows me to stay focused in particular tasks and stay interested in the things that I'm doing, and then bring those things together. And I think the thing that I could recommend most to folks at any level really is, if you're doing something that you feel like is monotonous, take on a project, take on a
Yeah.
hobby project within the business. It shows initiative and it cultivates the romance and the spirit of doing something new and learning something new and contributing to something new. Even if it's not your job, it might be mentally healthy to do that. And the serendipitous benefit is that you can advance your career while you're
Hmm.
learning new things.
Yeah, it almost reignites the enthusiasm because you kind of you see your fingerprint on something, you're driving it, it's your passion project. There's a lot to get out of that, and you also feel a sense of leadership and ownership there, right? Versus always being assigned things to do and just doing what you're told. You get to rise up and just kind of hold the steering wheel for a little bit and drive, which is people become enthusiastic just about that idea alone, and it should even stimulate creativity, a lot of upsides. I totally agree. We're almost at time, but curious, I think you're very inspiring to a lot of people and people who are trying to start companies and see other successful startups that have raised and exited. What would you say is your best piece of advice to individuals who are intimidated by the idea of building and creating a startup and are exhausted just kind of with their monotonous work and want to break free, but feel like there's a glass ceiling? How would you recommend they go about that?
Well, if you're, in the startup world, you have to have an appetite for risk. So, going into a business with the foresight that it might not work out, but you're going to try and not think about that. Alex Kennard, the rock climber who climbed El Capitan with no
Hmm.
ropes, right? Free climbing.
Right.
He's
Sure.
not thinking about falling. He's thinking about getting to the top. And I think you need to have that attitude. Even though it could happen, you could fall. You have to really focus on the end goal. And I believe that if you're in a startup where you believe in what you're doing and you believe that you're accomplishing something that betters the world or your customers or yourself in some kind of way, then you're not really going to work. You're fulfilling your your mission in your life. And I think this idea that we have work life balance when we're spending most of our waking hours and most of the week at work is kind of sad, as because work is always the dark side of that, when
Hmm.
we really should have work life integration, because our work is our lives, and to say any otherwise is really a not a great state. You need to date your job and keep it interesting, and you wouldn't have a partner and just punch the clock every day. You shouldn't do that with your work either. You should
Sure.
find it stimulating, and you should find ways that you're adding benefits to your professional life, just like you're adding benefits to your personal life, and integrating those things in a way that's healthy, I think, is really important, and that will create success. Um,
And I
and
love your concept of work-life integration.
yeah,
Curious, how did you integrate?
You know, my background is in food and cooking. So
Mhm,
it's been when I started very young in the kitchen, everybody that I was around was reading cookbooks and cooking at home. And then we'd go to work and we'd cook. And then we'd go work on a farm for a weekend. So that before Blue Apron, I was a professional chef and I got into the food business and supply chain, et cetera. And
mhm.
being able to integrate the anthropology and the lifestyle of that allowed me to translate that into other businesses. And when you're excited about the things that you're doing, it is very easy. And that goes back to dating your job, you know, getting excited about it, getting excited about going out or pitching to a customer or going to a site or buying a machine, whatever that part is, it should be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, and I think that translates to, the whole burnout conversation too, that if you're able to find that balance, that integration, it's also there's a shift in perspective that has to happen, that's very healthy. And if individuals are able to make that shift, and constantly reinforce that positive perspective, um, work will be a lot less taxing, which I think the inability to shift is why we're seeing this quiet quitting, passive aggressive behavior, is because pre and post COVID, we saw a lot of transitions, and we are expecting a lot of younger professionals to pivot pretty quickly, which is a skill, and I certainly recognize that. And but I think that it's well worth it if you're able to do this integration. It pays serious dividends. Otherwise, you're waking up every day and dragging yourself to work, and there's an expiration date for how long you could do that.
That's right. I totally agree.
Awesome. Well, Matthew, I appreciate you joining us. Congratulations on your success with the Blue Apron and all your other ventures. I appreciate your insight and your tips. I'm certain our listeners and viewers are also grateful. And we look forward to seeing you again on the show soon.
Thanks to me. I really appreciate it. Have a great week.
You too. Thank you. Excellent conversation. And I'm really glad I had a chance to share those chats with you. I think it's really important, listening to these interviews, that we strive for balance. At the end of the day, it's very important for an employee or any staff member to understand what their needs are and where they'll thrive and where they'll be the most successful. If they know a specific environment encourages, or promotes their burnout, they should avoid those environments. If they're non-productive or less productive in one setting versus another, they should be aware of that. At the end of the day, you're responsible for motivating yourself. There's only so much a manager or a leader could do to motivate an individual. But I would encourage everyone listening to set themselves up for success and really understand what the right work environment is for you. Some people do very well remotely, and they should find organizations that foster that. Others do very well in a 100% in person environment, and they should find those types of organizations. Personally, I really believe in balance, and I think what I've tried to create at my organization is that type of environment where a couple of days a week we're in person, we get to know each other, we collaborate. Some days you get to be home, do your thing, head down, get work done, and there's good balance there, which I think is preventing burnout, is increasing productivity, and keeping everyone intrinsically motivated. That said, that setup might not be right for you, and it's important for you to find what setup is right for you. So the answer to the question isn't really what other people think you should be doing, it's what you think you should be doing. And finding organizations that will support you and encourage you, and culturally you feel like a very, very good fit, and then you'll excel. So I think that the challenge is just better understanding, having that self awareness, and then reflecting on where you currently are, if you are currently working, and seeing if there's alignment there. So I think that's very, very important. To summarize, I think the idea of burnout and productivity do kind of challenge one another. You know, as you are experiencing more and more burnout, you're becoming less and less productive. But if you're very, very productive, you will experience burnout. So in order to navigate that tug of war, we go back to that original idea of balance that I was talking about. And it's important to do that self-assessment where, how productive am I? How close was I feeling to being fatigued or disinterested or dissatisfied with my work? Where was it that I have that best balance and I'm the most satisfied? And then really doubling down when you're in that environment, and if you're not currently in that environment, finding that environment so you could really thrive and be successful. So reflecting on your own work habits, what you have to do to achieve that work-life balance, like we just talked about in the interview, and integrating that into your life is really, really important. And I hope listening to these conversations and hearing my perspective uh, gives you extra insight and encourages you and motivates you to self-reflect and find the best opportunity for yourself so you could be the best possible self you could be. Thank you for joining us again. I'm Dr. T. This is Candid Minds. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you for listening. Please follow us or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Please follow us at Mindful Care and at TikTok Psychiatrist for more. And don't forget to rate and review.